In my career in the FBI, I chased God knows how many spies around the DC area. We caught quite a few, many that I can't talk about because it's still classified. And at the very end of my career, I was asked to join an undercover investigation that had been put together in less than a month to catch the most damaging spy in US history, an FBI agent, a veteran FBI agent named Robert Philip Hansen. Now, Robert Hansen had been an FBI agent for almost 25 years. In fact, when we learned about him, he was about to retire in April. At the very end of his career, a foreign source gave us information that pointed to Hansen. We built a brand new division in FBI headquarters, which had never been done before, so purely to trap the spy, put him in charge of what was called the Information Assurance Section. Now, this is 2000 and 2001. We got to go back in time here. And information assurance back in 2000, 2001 is what we now call cybersecurity. So we took the most damaging spy in US history and put him in charge of building cybersecurity for the FBI, purely to, one, cause him to not retire and come back and take a job that he felt was truly within his bailiwick, but also, two, put him in the position to have access to information that he could steal and then hopefully put in a drop site to the Russians in order to continue his espionage career. We had to catch him red-handed because we only had circumstantial evidence. This is sort of a long way to explain how I learned everything that became the precepts, the foreknowledge for all my theories in cybersecurity and how I've taken counterintelligence and used it to augment cybersecurity. And on the first day of my investigation in this new division in the FBI, where I was placed in order to identify whether he was the spy we were after and then find a way to catch him, he told me words that I've never forgotten. In fact, words that a law, what he called Hansen's Law, that have become the beginning of everything that I have developed as a thought leader in cybersecurity. He looked me in the eye and he said, "Eric, the spy is always in the worst possible place." My little mind was working and I was thinking, here we are in the middle of cybersecurity for the FBI, and that probably is the worst possible place. So is he trying to tell me that he's the spy? Is he challenging me? Is he just trying to throw me off? I didn't know at that time, but I kept a poker face. I looked right back at him and I said, "What do you mean by that? I don't remember learning that at the FBI Academy in Quantico." And he shook his head and he said, "They don't teach it there. They should. If they did, we'd be better at what we do. But here's what you need to know. This law, what I call Hansen's Law, the spy is always in the worst possible place. And if you want to be a talented counterintelligence agent, this is all you need to know." And he said, the spy is that person that has access to that information and the knowledge and wherewithal to get that information into the hands of those who will use it to do the most damage and pay that person the most money. And that is who we are hunting. And he was completely correct. The spy is always in the worst possible place. Not only for the FBI, there he was. For the intelligence community, it was Robert Hansen. But in any organization, that spy is in the worst possible place for you. They're able to access information, they're able to extract the information, and they're able to get it into the hands of those who are going to do the most damage. I've taken that early learning that I learned from him, from the worst spy in US history, and I've developed it into all my theories in cybersecurity. And today, I've developed it into the idea that there are no hackers. There are only spies. The modern cyber attackers, the modern spies, the modern cyber criminals are sophisticated, well-funded, numerous. It's not just one person. And they are targeting a single individual using traditional spy methods to fool that person into doing something that they otherwise would not do, which is why spear phishing, for example, is still the most prevalent cyber attack. Getting someone to click a link or open an attachment that they know they shouldn't do, but they do through an email. And that is how the majority of cyber attacks still happen. And so when I say there are no hackers, there are only spies, what I'm saying is that hacking is nothing more than the necessary evolution of espionage. And so we have to hunt threats before they hunt us, because the spies are coming after that data that is now the currency of our lives. So the old method of sharing and transmitting and collaborating was on paper, right? We used to have memos, and we used to type up things, and we used to have files and file cabinets. And this is quite some time ago, but we've computerized. Everything is data now. Everything is collaborated on within computer systems. We're highly networked. In the last year and a half of the pandemic, most of our collaboration has been done over computer systems with incredible bandwidth that allows us to communicate around the world at the speed of thought. And so Hansen's old law, the spies in the worst possible place, had to be updated. And so what I did is I took that old law, and over years of thinking and in writing my book, Gray Day, I updated it into what I call O'Neill's law, sort of as a nod to my former boss. And O'Neill's law is this: hacking is a necessary evolution of espionage. There are no hackers, there are only spies. We must hunt the threat before the threat hunts us, because the spy is always in the worst possible place. And if you apply that law to the discipline of cybersecurity, then you'll be able to catch those spies and elevate your thinking to going after attackers who are cyber attackers, cyber spies, cyber terrorists, but aren't hackers. The hackers were all the people in the 80s, people like me, who were interested in cybersecurity and how to breach cybersecurity as a way of making it stronger. And they're all working for cybersecurity companies right now. The cyber attackers right now are spies and criminals who are acting just like the spies of old. Well, healthcare data it truly has many of the same or similar personally identifiable information, what we call PII, sort of the holy grail of what we want to protect, that financial and many other verticals hold. If you think of what you're providing to your healthcare provider, including insurance information, you're giving your name, often your email address, your phone number. When you are going to a medical appointment, sometimes you have to provide a copy of your driver's license. So in some, insurance still uses your social security number and birth date to authenticate that you have that insurance. If you look at the dark web, so we'll get to the dark web, but the dark web is a online database of information that you can't get to unless you absolutely know exactly where to go and you're using a particular web browser in order to hunt there. And there are criminals, there are law enforcement, there are all sorts of people there, but you can buy and sell virtually anything. It's sort of the new pirate island, the criminal marketplace. Medical records there sell for anywhere from $1, if it's not a particularly useful one, to $1,000 on the dark web. In fact, medical records are second only to passports in value on the dark web. So medical records are something that buy and sell very well on this evil marketplace. And so stealing them and selling them online on the dark web can be very lucrative. And so this information can lead to everything from identity theft or further information about a person to launch another breach. You can learn all sorts of things about about a person, their social security number, their birth date, and then you can target that person in order to attack that person or attack that person's company. And cyber criminals also steal this sensitive information, and then they extort companies for money. So if you're a healthcare provider, that information could be stolen from you, and then the attacker comes back and says, we've got this big database of your information, and if you don't pay us this money, we're going to release it online. And it's going to cause massive reputational damage. In 2014, during the Sochi Winter Olympics, the Russians were embarrassed. After a state-sponsored subversion of the drug testing process was discovered, there was this report. And then for the next Olympics, the 2018 Olympics, Russia couldn't fly their flag. Their Olympic athletes had to independently compete. In October 2018, the US Department of Justice charged Russian GRU, that's the military arm of Russia's spy agency, a number of 7 GRU officers with cyber attacks against anti-doping organizations. And 7, as I said, cyber spies were indicted. So what they did is they stole medical records of prominent athletes, international athletes, altered them to falsely show that the athletes had tested positive for illegal substances, and then fed those same reports, those medical records, through their fake social media accounts to credible social media sources, which got to mainstream media in order to discredit international athletes. They were angry that they had been found out, so they were trying to make it look like, well, everyone's doing this, sort of like a sour grapes analysis. So it's not just that the healthcare data is at risk. It can be used by spies to spread disinformation, and this was a major issue that happened in 2018. And it's not just disinformation. Healthcare data can be at risk, right? So researchers in Israel just recently announced just last year that they'd created a computer virus capable of adding tumors into CT and MRI scans. So they designed this malware. Now this was purely, in looking at what could happen to build better security. But the malware was designed to fool doctors into misdiagnosing high-profile patients. And if the security companies can do that, well, the bad guys certainly can as well. And also, during COVID, hacking patients' medical devices became very common. So it's a vector of cyber attack during the pandemic because more patients are using remote care. So they're not in the hospital where they're a little better protected. And the healthcare industry, by the way, it's not just that they're under attack, they're being used to launch cyber attacks against everybody else. So you might have heard that spear phishing is the #1 way that we're getting hit by these major cyber attacks. And the problem is it works. And spear phishing is where you receive an email. The email looks like it's from someone you trust, but it's really not. It's from an attacker. And you click on that link in the email, or you click on the attachment, and that loads the malware into your system, and now the attacker has a way in. Well, COVID-19 phishing exploded in 2020 and 2021. And many of the scams seem to come from organizations such as the WHO, the World Health Organization, and the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. So what we were seeing were an email from WHO, everything from very early in 2020, from the CDC, click here and register to get in line for your for your vaccine or from your antibody test. If you remember back then, everybody wanted an antibody test before we knew really what they were useful for, and you had to get in line and you would click here, or there would come from the CDC or the WHO saying, click here and register to get on a list to be one of the first to receive the vaccine for COVID-19 when it comes out. And people were doing it because they were afraid. This heightened fear and pressure meant that they were less likely to question the viability or the verifiability of this email that they were given, and they were clicking. People do things that they wouldn't ordinarily do out of fear. And already overburdened healthcare IT and cybersecurity teams have been tasked to keep up with all these new threats. And when spear phishing explodes, it puts more pressure on IT, which means that if IT and cybersecurity are pressured, it makes it harder to stop the threats and stop these cyber attacks. So healthcare data is incredibly valuable, but the healthcare industry, especially during a medical pandemic, can be used to launch all sorts of other cyber attacks. And criminals are clever, and spies are even more clever, and the criminals are learning from them. And so the healthcare industry has been a major vector, not only of attack, but using to attack others. One in 4 people click on that link or open that attachment that they know they shouldn't. So in a room, in a room of 4 people, one person is going to click on that spear phishing link, and it doesn't matter the training they get. It doesn't matter how careful they are. Some of these attacks are incredibly clever. So they're going to send you a spear phishing email that targets you, that has researched everything that you've put on social media, that knows about you, that knows something you're interested in or something you're worried about, that's going to give you either that pressure or that heightened interest that makes you want to click through because you see the email, you see it comes from a trusted source, or you believe it's a trusted source, or it's something you're very interested in or worried about. And so there's more pressure to click. Of course, the right thing to do is always just to delete the email and go directly to the source, right? Using your web browser and typing it in, not actually clicking those links or opening the attachments. I never do that in emails unless I'm 100% sure that it came from the person that I know it came from. But especially in a pandemic, when we're in a pressure situation, you could be encouraged. So if 1 in 4 people are clicking on these things, then it makes it much harder to stop, particularly when spies are getting into the mix and they're sending targeted approaches that can fool anybody. In 2019, the healthcare sector was being attacked. And remember, this is pre-pandemic, second only to government in cyber attacks. So the government, right, because this is what spies are traditionally always attacking, the healthcare sector was second only to the traditional vector of attack for cyber spies. In 2018, if we go back one more year, right, once again, pre-pandemic, there were 15 million patient records compromised in 503 breaches. By May of 2019, there was one breach where 25 million records were stolen. So that's 10 million more in one breach when it took 503 breaches just to get to 15 million in 2018. Now in 2020, 2021, during the pandemic, the healthcare sector is predicted to fall victim to 2 to 3 times more cyber attacks than any other vector, which means they beat the government. They're the #1 vector of cyber attacks for spies and criminals. And here's a sobering statistic. More than 93% of healthcare organizations have experienced a data breach over the past 3 years, and 57% have had more than 5 data breaches during the same time frame. So that's pretty significant. If you look at all the verticals out there, finance, healthcare, government, industry, healthcare beats them all. So by all studies and records, the healthcare industry has been decimated by cyber attacks in 2020 and 2021, and it makes complete sense. Healthcare is in the middle of a pressure situation. Now, I always say, never examine your cybersecurity in the middle of a pressure situation. It's the worst time to be examining security in general, whether you're going to look at locks or doors, whether you're going to look at cyber attacks, whether you're going to look at cybersecurity. You always want to examine your cybersecurity, figure out how you're going to protect that data that is the currency of your life before you're in the middle of this attack, before you're in the middle of a pressure situation. Because when you're in the middle of the attack, you're spinning. You're trying to figure out everything from how do we communicate with each other. If you're locked by, for example, ransomware, you can't use your typical networks in order to communicate. So how are you going to even figure out how to get out of the attack? And during the pressure situation, you're also working on so many other things that it's hard to have the bandwidth to determine how to get out of the cyber attack. So it's always better to examine the pressure situation before, but it's too late now. We're in the middle of one of the worst pressure situations we've been in since the terrorist attacks in the United States in September 11th, 2001. This pandemic has caused enormous change across every single aspect of our lives. We're living differently than we ever have before. And during this pandemic, this crisis, the bad guys are using it. They're not going to let a crisis go to waste. The worst people on earth never let a crisis go to waste. And of course, cyber attackers and criminals are some of the worst people on earth. And so they're launching attacks mercilessly, and they know that one of the most vulnerable verticals in the world is the healthcare industry. There are a couple reasons for that. Unfortunately, it's been well known for some time that healthcare is a little behind the curve in good cybersecurity. Healthcare also is in one of the biggest pressure situations as they're trying to provide for people who are dying of coronavirus and at the same time being hit by cyber attacks. And healthcare is particularly susceptible to ransomware attacks. So because you're vulnerable and because you're susceptible to extortion, attackers are mercilessly attacking the healthcare vectors right now more than any other. And ransomware is the main method that cyber criminals are launching attacks on healthcare. So for the entire medical field, if cybersecurity isn't at the top of your mind and you are in the middle of a crisis right now, now is the time to deal with it. Not next week, not down the road. It's this moment is to get your cybersecurity bolstered and is to be preparing yourself for the cyber attack that is eventually going to come. None of us live on a digital island. Let me put it that way. You are only as safe as your neighbor on that island when you're connected. So by connecting healthcare accounts, and I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, I think this is the way that we need to go, you become vulnerable if a vendor you use or a collaborative different company that is connected to your data, your healthcare data that you are connected to is vulnerable. Earlier, or in December 2020, a major company called SolarWinds was attacked. Now, SolarWinds provides a network managing tool for virtually everyone, including the major agencies of the US government. SolarWinds was attacked by Russia, by Russian intelligence. And they attacked SolarWinds not to steal anything from SolarWinds, but to inject malicious software into an update that went out to all of their customers. And their customers downloaded the update and then were infected by malware, and then the Russian intelligence unit could pick and choose from the compromised customers of SolarWinds, which included 9 US agencies, including Department of Homeland Security and Commerce, State, and others, that they could steal information with, and about 150 major businesses that were potentially compromised. That's called a supply chain attack. It's not just the spies. Very recently, in the last few months, a company called Kaseya, who provides another important tool to MSPs, managed service providers, was attacked once again, not to attack Kaseya, but to inject malicious software into an update that went out to all of their customers. Now, MSPs provide all sorts of software solutions to other customers. So you can see there was a domino effect. You attack the big company that provides an update to all their customers who provide updates to all of their customers, and it's exponential. The difference here was it wasn't a foreign intelligence unit. It was cyber criminals who modeled the attack for SolarWinds and another supply chain attack. Now, supply chain attacks work really well. I mean, Microsoft was hit by China using the same sort of supply chain attack to hit their Exchange server, and everybody who used Microsoft's calendar was potentially at risk from Chinese intelligence. So yes, you can see vendor-based attacks, supply chain attacks over against the healthcare industry, where you're launching attacks against someone who has access in order to get at the company who has better cybersecurity in order to steal that data. Or big supply chain attacks against major healthcare companies who provide support to a number of other healthcare companies in order to get at all the other healthcare companies. And it's going to happen. If it hasn't already, it probably has already. We haven't learned about it. So the lesson here for healthcare is that you are only as strong as your weakest link. And like I said, no one lives on a digital island. You need to ensure that everybody that connects to your data has strong levels of cybersecurity. And the solution there is when you contract with a vendor When you partner with someone who is going to have access to your data, examine their cybersecurity. Make sure that their cybersecurity is strong. And I think that the future here is the best in breed, multi-cloud, cloud-based cybersecurity, where everybody is using cloud-based cybersecurity with security built in, not bolted on, so that everything that's accessed is constantly being scrubbed to make sure that the best cybersecurity is looking at the data and making sure that that data isn't compromised. I was just looking through news reports earlier this week on the medical industry to prepare for this interview. And there are many smaller healthcare centers or hospitals or clinics that have closed their doors because of cyber attacks. They can't even deal with the reputational damage or the cost of remediating the attack. That means finding out what happened, where it landed, and ways to stop it in the future. Or the cost of protecting or dealing with lawsuits because of lost healthcare data in order to even build better cybersecurity and stay open. And so a ransomware attack, for example, can be incredibly damaging if you're a small healthcare provider that can't afford the cost of surviving the cyber attack, much less finding out how to become better. So that's why it's better to invest ahead of the attack and prevent the attack from happening, because it can close the doors on small companies. I think in the future, cybersecurity has to move to where everybody is invested in cybersecurity, where we create sort of a collective consciousness of cloud-based cybersecurity, where if one entity is attacked over here, everybody else in this massive cyber ecosystem, cloud-based cybersecurity ecosystem, is now protected. You're inoculated because that one attack is quickly analyzed, you learn from it, and then everyone else is protected. That's where we're pushing. That's where the best cybersecurity is pushing right now, and I think that is going to be the future. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to be decimated by cyber attacks over and over, and we're bleeding far too much resources, money, and time into dealing with cyber attacks that, especially during a pandemic, could be used elsewhere. Of all internet crimes, business email compromise, romance fraud, ransomware, everything, were $4 billion in losses. So they calculate what the loss is for all of those different cyber attacks. So that's everything, not just ransomware. But the actual number one internet crime in 2020 was business email compromise. That's where someone uses data about a person to steal their credentials, and then usually through a spear phishing attack, which is why it's business email compromise. And then they use that information to use a very unique way of identity theft. What they do is they pretend they are that person into that person's financial institution, withdraw money from their legitimate bank account, move it to an illegitimate bank account, a cryptocurrency account typically, and then steal the funds that way. That's the number one. Romance fraud, by the way, was way up there, where you start talking to someone online, particularly because we're lonely during the pandemic. A lot of people are, especially during the time when we were all locked in our homes, and in some places in the world, you couldn't even leave your home. And people were talking to other people and getting a lot of their social outlet online. And of course, the fraudsters were there, creating relationships over chat, and then finally saying, I need some money for, I've got COVID, I need some money because I can't afford healthcare, or hey, can you send me some money and I'll fly to see you? And of course, that they never showed up, or they didn't really need the money. And of course, it's wired somewhere where it can't be tracked. And so there's a lot of that happening as well. Ransomware is probably number 3. Ransomware has really been around since 2003 or earlier. This is not a new thing, but ransomware was made famous in February 5 of 2016 in a healthcare attack. So Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center, one morning, the nurses and doctors came into the hospital, and all of their systems were shut down, grinning skulls, and there was a ransomware notice saying, you've been locked by ransomware, you're now encrypted, you must pay $17,000 in Bitcoin in order to get your systems back up. Now, they didn't pay, and for weeks, the doctors and nurses were using pen and paper to provide medical care. I like to think my mom was a nurse, and she used to, I remember she used to come home and she would have things written on her arm, like medical record, little like this, the blood pressure and whatever, just before she could get it on the chart. And I hate to think that in Hollywood Presbyterian and in some other ransomware attacks in the medical industry, these poor nurses have like a whole sleeve of stuff written because they can't add things electronically, which is the way that it happens now. You can't look at the doctors couldn't look up medical records quickly. You can't quickly share X-rays or other test results, and it meant that some of these acute care patients had to be moved out. Well, this happened in 2016. So, like I said, this isn't anything new for the medical field. And back then, by the way, 17,000 was only 40 Bitcoin. I think like a percentage of a Bitcoin right now, 1 Bitcoin would be 17,000. But the hospital had to pay. And this was pretty expensive for the hospital right then. It was a novel case. The FBI was involved, and they still had to pay because they didn't have backup systems. They didn't have good cybersecurity. They had no way of getting out of it. So they had to pay. Now, just an idea of how the ransomware attack happens. The cyber attackers find a way in. Normally, it is a spear phishing attack where they identify somebody who has access within the network. They attack that person using an email that has a link or an attachment in it that fools the person into clicking or opening the attachment or going to a web form that they fill out and gives them access. And because once again, this person receiving the email trusts it, then the attacker has a way into the network. They start moving laterally within the network. They create more credentials. They're usually looking for people who are systems administrators or in IT, so they can create more accounts. They start compromising accounts until they can get deep into the system, and then they bring it all down at once by encrypting all of the medical center or the hospital's data at once. That data is now no longer accessible. The network's not accessible. The computer systems aren't accessible. And the attackers can manipulate the computer systems. And so when you sit down at your computer system, all you see is some sort of screen that the attackers have created. They're bad guys, so they like skulls. There's usually some stupid skull. And there's messages. Sometimes they say things like, we've encrypted using military-grade encryption. Here is why you will not be able to crack this. You must pay. More and more attackers are using things like a timer, and it says that if you do not pay by this time, we're going to delete all your information. Now, today, because we're gotten much better about backups and being able to restore from secure backups, attackers are extorting as well. They're saying, not only have we encrypted your data and you pay us and we give you the decryption key so you can unlock your data, they're also saying, if you don't pay, then we're going to start releasing your data into the public bit by bit until you pay. That's extortion. And so what's happening is, if you're not prepared, if you don't have good cybersecurity, if you're locked by ransomware, you're paying. So this isn't new. It started happening to healthcare in 2016, and it's continued. The healthcare vertical has been very susceptible to ransomware, especially during the pandemic, and cyber attacks on the healthcare systems have spiked. And this threatens patient care and private data. Here's another example. In October 28, 2020, just recently, the IT desk at the University of Vermont Medical Center starts receiving dozens of calls from staff, and they're complaining about problems accessing their computer systems. And so the medical center, this is sort of a good use case scenario, right? They quickly did some analysis, and they found malicious software, what we call malware, that were instructing staff to contact the cyber attackers. So what the medical center did is they shut everything down. So typically what this was is they're seeing the email phishing and they intercepted it before the attackers could shut down the medical center with ransomware. But here's the problem. They shut down everything: email, internet, and the majority of the medical center's network. They had to, because otherwise, perhaps the attackers who were already in the network would have pulled the trigger and locked them down with ransomware. Unfortunately, for nearly a month, the University of Vermont Medical Center couldn't use electronic health records or their payroll programs. And for days, the staff didn't know which patients were scheduled for appointments. So surgeries had to be rescheduled. Cancer patients had to go elsewhere for their radiation treatment, all sorts of things like that. The attack cost them an estimated $50 million, and mostly from lost revenue because they couldn't treat new patients. It took the IT staff 3 weeks working 24/7. Man, can you imagine the burden on the poor IT staff to scrub the network systems and restore thousands of affected computers? And it turns out that if you just look broadly, 34% of healthcare organizations globally reported being hit by ransomware in 2020. And 65% of those that were hit by ransomware in the last year said that the cybercriminals succeeded in encrypting their data. That's pretty significant. So it's one thing to say I've been hit by ransomware, but hey, I had cybersecurity and I was able to at least alleviate some of the attack. 65%, that's more than half, are saying that their data was encrypted, which means that they were successfully locked by ransomware. And that means that they either had to pay, they probably had to pay, or they had a good backup that they could restore from. And that assumes that the cyber criminals aren't also extorting them, like I said, at the same time, saying, if you don't pay, we're going to start releasing your data. So it doesn't matter if you're going to restore from backup. If your data is already stolen as well, you're in a lot of trouble. To talk about ransomware, we have to talk about the dark web. So the dark web I like to describe as sort of the pirate island of the internet. It's where all the bad guys go to broker and sell and buy all of the malicious software and cyber attacks that are out there, including cyber ransomware attacks. You can buy anything on the dark web. The healthcare industry might be interested to know that the dark web also has what's called the body parts bazaar. And this is a really macabre aspect of the dark web, so we might as well talk about it. It's where you can buy body parts. Everything from a liver to a kidney to eyeballs, anything you want can be bought and sold on the dark web, including cyber attackers for hire, who can be bought to launch cyber attacks against everything from schools to hospitals to businesses that are out there. And according to the World Economic Forum, the dark web has now become the third largest economy on Earth. Third largest economy. So it still goes the US, China, they're moving up, and still US, China, and then the dark web is the third largest economy on Earth. And in the custom malware that's being built and sold on the dark web, which means, software engineers who decide they want to go into the criminal side or they want to make some extra money on the side are building custom, brand new, never before seen malware attacks that your typical cybersecurity isn't even going to spot. At VMware Carbon Black, we did a study in 2020, and in 2020, ransomware was responsible for 14% of all successful cyber attacks, and that's double 2019. That's a pretty big statistic. Because there are a huge number of cyber attacks out there, and a big piece of the pie is ransomware. Some more statistics. The largest ransomware demand now stands at $70 million that hasn't been paid. The largest actual paid one is $40 million. And the average ransomware payment in the first half of 2021 was $570,000. In 2020, it was $300,000. And a new tactic of ransomware, as I said, is extortion. The FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center has received over 2,000 ransomware complaints. That's a lot. That's over 16.8 million in losses year to date, just in ransomware. That's a 62% increase in reported incidents and a 20% increase in reported losses compared with 2020. So ransomware is a big deal, especially in the healthcare sector. And as I said, the first big ransomware huge attack that made the media and put ransomware on the page was launched against a hospital, a healthcare center here in the United States. And since then, ransomware has been one of the most prolific and best utilized cyber attacks out there, particularly against the medical healthcare sector. So the pandemic truly changed everything about how we work and how we live. The only comparable I have is how our entire lives changed after the events that happened in September 11th, 2021, when there was an attack against the World Trade Center, a terrorist attack against the World Trade Center in the United States. The towers came down and the entire world changed. Terrorism became one of the biggest concerns, and how we traveled changed forever. It didn't change for a month. It didn't change for a year. It changed forever. We are still concerned about the same sort of terrorist attacks. And there, a handful of terrorists boarded a plane with box cutters, took over the captain's cabin, and then flew planes into buildings. We still have to take off our shoes, go through a variety of different medical detectors. Your loved ones can't walk with you to the gate. We were able to do that before September 11th. And universally, we are checked and poked and prodded before we ever board a plane. So travel has changed significantly. That's the comparable to what's happened during this pandemic. I like to think of the pandemic as pandemic 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. Pandemic 1.0 was the biggest change that we went through. One day we were all in offices. Now the healthcare industry is a little different. If you work in a hospital, you're sort of the front line. You're critical providers, and so many in the healthcare industry obviously didn't suddenly go home. But for a good part of the world, we were in our office, and IT was happy because you went into your office, you sat down at your computer. The computer was configured by IT, and every app on that computer, every program was authenticated, was given the thumbs up by IT, and they knew exactly what in that ecosystem could get in and what couldn't get in, and there were all sorts of protections in place. And then the next day, after the WHO declared COVID-19 a pandemic, everyone was home, or majority of the workforce was home. And IT was completely overburdened from one moment to the next, because we weren't at home with those configured workstations. We were at home with whatever anyone had. Their laptop at home, their kid's laptop, something they borrowed from their grandma, an old computer. Even if you were bringing your laptop from work that was configured home, you're hooking it up to a router, your personal router that might not be secure. People were working from places like coffee shops that had open internet, which is decidedly unsecure because they didn't have good internet at home, or they didn't have internet at home. People were working on their smart devices over cellular networks because they didn't have internet. There was a grab bag of different systems, different places, different locations, and there was no way to go from a on-prem premises workforce to an immediate distributed workforce and build cybersecurity in an instant. So 1.0 was a disaster. 2.0, pandemic 2.0, is how we have learned over the last almost 2 years, a year and 8 months, to work in a distributed workforce, in now a new cloud-based environment, which is how the world works now. We went where everything was on-prem using servers to now everything has to be done through the cloud in some way, shape, or form. Otherwise, we can't collaborate, we can't share, because everything is data now, everything is networked. And how do we do that and build security into that? And during this time, during pandemic 2.0, there have been an unprecedented number of cyber attacks. So if you look at those IC3 statistics that I pointed you out to, 4 times the number in the prior year before the pandemic, and growing year after year. And we've been suffering a massive bleed off of resources and time because of these cyber attacks, an unprecedented number of them. Some of the biggest cyber attacks in history have happened in the last year. And pandemic 3.0 is now, as we start to open and learn how to go back to work, how are we going to do this when the workforce doesn't want to be in the office full time? Recent polls during the last, 18 months have shown that people don't want to be full time in the office anymore. If we look at just some of the statistics over the last few years, a staggering 91% of all global respondents in a study that VMware Carbon Black did in our 2020 Global Threat Report, a staggering 91% of all global respondents stated that they had seen an increase in overall cyber attacks as a result of employees working from home. Of course, because we're working from home in unsecured devices, in all sorts of different devices that haven't been configured or maintained by IT, or devices that have no cybersecurity at all. And destructive attacks, by the way, and these aren't just attacks where it's cyber attacks to steal data, but destructive attacks, where cyber attackers are destroying data or changing data, have increased 118%, as cyberspace during this pandemic has become more hostile. You have to start by building a cybersecurity framework that relies on the number one technique in cybersecurity today: zero trust. And zero trust, if you want to break it down, is a geeky cybersecurity term that basically means that all users, human and machine, authenticate and are verified before they access that data. And like I like to say, that is this currency of our lives. Certainly the currency of lives in the healthcare industry, because that healthcare data, the ability to protect from ransomware attacks, that is the most important thing right now if you want to protect from cyber attacks. So zero trust means that you're going to stop the phishing emails. You're going to stop the attacks where attackers are just buying usernames and passwords off the dark web and then just trying them against your employees until they find one that hits, because nobody ever changes their password. Zero trust is going to create a secure cloud environment, because in pandemic 3.0, as we learn how to go back to work, if you were going to have workers who are working from home and working on premises, in your office, the only way to do that is by leveraging the cloud. Our data has to live in the cloud. Otherwise, we can't collaborate, because people will be in all sorts of different places. So zero trust means you're going to need 5 good things. The first is a secure cloud environment, right? You're going to leverage the cloud in order to have security built into the cloud so that every time you're accessing your data, security is constantly looking and scrubbing. You need to have access management. You need to segment your network, which means that everybody in your company, every single person, every employee shouldn't have access to everything. Employees should only have access to those areas of your network, that data that is critical to them, that's important to them, that they have a need to know, if you want to use a spy term. If they don't have a need to know it, if they're not supposed to be working on it, they shouldn't have access to it. That way, if that employee's credentials are compromised by an attacker, they can only get into some of your data, not everything. And security can see that that account is trying to access something they shouldn't, and can immediately lock down that account and prevent it from accessing any data. And that way, security can constantly be working behind the scenes to identify that there is a possible breach. As part of that, you have to remove inactive accounts. Inactive accounts can often be used by attackers because they buy them on the dark web and then use them to attack you. So secure cloud environment, access management, that's 1 and 2. 3 is harden your systems. So harden your systems using multi-factor authentication or just completely getting rid of the password entirely and using a single sign-on approach. You can't rely on passwords. You have to have something in addition to the password because passwords are 100% useless in protecting against cyber attacks. Why? Most people use incredibly weak passwords. Passwords can be guessed, especially if sophisticated spies or cyber criminals who are learning from spies are researching employees using social media. It makes it pretty easy to guess a password. They can also use spear phishing to attack a person directly and get their password that way. People also use the same passwords for everything. They'll come up with one strong password and they'll use it for everything, from their business account at their employer's account, to their bank accounts, to the account for an app where they're buying their favorite ice cream. And any one of those could get breached. Now it's for sale on the dark web, and now the attacker has access to everything. Single sign-on is great because you don't even need a password. You have a username, and then you use an authenticator app, which uses the best levels of encryption. So you need something else. So multi-factor authentication, at least, where you enter your username, your password, and then you get a text on your phone, for example, where you have to enter a third unique code. That second factor for authentication is critical in protecting yourself. And then finally, number 5, watch out for Robert Hansen. Be a spy hunter. You have to also look for the trusted insider within your organization who isn't the sort of person who isn't an external cyber attack, but is a person, an employee inside that's gone rogue. There are lots of cases of this, but I looked hard for one that's in the for a really good one that's in the medical industry, and I had to look back in my rogues gallery of spies and traitors and hackers and cyber attackers back to 2011 for this great case about this guy named Jesse McGraw. Now Jesse McGraw had a also known as, which is Ghost Exodus, the name, of course, he gave himself, leader of the Electronic Tribulation Army. So Ghost Exodus, this guy named Jesse McGraw, was a cyber attacker. He called himself a top cyber attacker. And he was actually caught by the FBI, because he wasn't particularly brilliant at this, posting a YouTube video of himself installing malicious software in a hospital computer. And while he was doing this YouTube video of himself installing the malware directly into a hospital computer, he showed off a collection of infiltration gear that he had put together. Lockpicks, a cell phone jammer, fake FBI credentials. And he was able to install his malicious software on multiple computers, including a nurse's station that had access to medical record, so could steal the medical records directly, and a backdoor into the HVAC unit, the climate control unit or the air conditioning unit, that could change the temperature in the storage facility for drugs. So what he could do technically, and he was showing all this off, is he could change the temperature for the climate controlled drugs that could change them or alter them, and that could harm patients. Now he was caught and of course arrested, and it turned out that he was able to do all this because he was the night security guard at the Texas hospital that was compromised. And worse, what he was doing as a trusted insider was not just stealing from that hospital or attacking that hospital to steal from the hospital, but used the hospital to launch cyber attacks against other organizations. So that hospital not only could have been compromised, but embarrassed, because when those other organizations figured out how they were cyber attacked, it would lead back to the hospital. So you have to beware that trusted insider, not just the external cyber attacks, but the ones that can come from within. I think that the healthcare industry takes cybersecurity very seriously. I think that there have been enough massive cyber attacks against the healthcare industry that you can't but take it seriously. And in a recent study by Abbott, 91% of hospital administrators considered the security of data as a top focus in the last year. But there's always a but, right? But 62% of these same administrators feel inadequately trained or unprepared to mitigate cyber risks that could impact their hospital. So what does that mean? That means the healthcare industry is taking it seriously, but they don't think they're ready to stop a cyber attack. Like I said earlier, healthcare is just behind the curve in cybersecurity and has to get better. Late last year, it was reported that hospitals hit by a data breach or ransomware can expect to see an increase in the death rate among heart patients because of cybersecurity remediation efforts. That came from a study by Vanderbilt University, where, by the way, my youngest brother is a new doctor. And that's because when hospitals in particular are spending a lot of time and energy in remediating and stopping a cyber attack, it means that they're not providing care, that their care is disrupted. This is something that attackers know. They know that this disruption will, particularly in ransomware, lead a hospital to pay faster, which is why ransomware attackers are targeting healthcare more than any other vertical right now, any other industry, because of that pressure to pay. So I think that, to sum up that answer, healthcare is taken very seriously. They have to, but healthcare is still behind the curve and has a lot of work to do to become better in cybersecurity. And it's critical that healthcare does so. Not today, not tomorrow, but yesterday. They have a lot of work to do.